All right, so we're going to get started, everybody. Thank you for coming. First, quick show of hands. How many of you like science? Remember, Dr. Katz and Mr. Williams are watching. How many of you like science? Good, good answer. How many of you like technology? Okay. Engineering. Less. How about art and design? Let's put that in there. Some of that in there too. Great. And how about mathematics? Some math lovers in here too. Excellent. How many of you are familiar with the acronym that you just spelled out? STEAM. STEM? STEAM? Okay. Great. My hope today is to give you a little bit of insight into the idea of STEM and STEAM and what it means. Let me actually ask you one more question. How many of you have been told by your parents that you're going to be an engineer? Okay, at least one. There's been at least one in every group. Yeah, I've heard that. How about a doctor? You're going to be a doctor. Great. I feel it's really important, especially with respect to your career, that because it's you who are going to be doing the work in the end, it's really important that you understand what is involved in your particular career choice and that it is meaningful to you. And so part of what I see as my role today is to make sure that you understand what I mean or what people mean when they talk about STEM, about science versus engineering, about math versus technology, science versus math, and what are the connections between these. And so I actually want to start with this idea of STEM as a concept. Right? A lot of the time we see science, technology, engineering, and math, and we say, these are the courses that matter, which of course makes the social studies teachers and the English teachers upset, because STEM, where's the role of communication and understanding the context of where these ideas come in, right? It maybe gets a little bit different if you start talking about STEAM instead, so now arts is part of the conversation, arts and design, the design process, really important. But again, it leaves things out. And so you might be inclined to think that, well, these are ones that matter. Anything that's not in the acronym doesn't. So let's just focus on this. And my argument today is that that's not actually what we mean when we talk about STEM or STEAM, or sometimes it's rearranged into teams or STEM plus medicine, right? This is more of a philosophy. It's a way of looking at the world in a very particular way, specifically in a way of trying to understand how we solve the biggest challenges, the big problems that exist in our world. Okay. This here is a piece of art, and this is something that right now is in the University of Akron Children's Hospital by an artist named George Rose. His big question, the question he was trying to solve, is how do we make a hospital a more positive place for children? How do we allow children who are in this location, in this building, getting treatments for diseases? How do we make it so that they can still find happiness, be curious, see something that makes them happy, makes them ask questions? How do we do that? So you can see there's all sorts of different parts that go together into the creation of this art, right? No one would say that this is purely an arts piece. There's science and understanding how to piece this together. There's technology in action here. So getting all of these things together and trying to answer that big question of how we make a hospital a more positive place is the problem that this solution aims to solve. That is what STEM is all about. It's finding a creative, innovative, effective solution to a problem that exists. So I went to New Zealand during vacation. There's a great company there called Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab is a group of engineers that got together and tried to answer a very different question, and that was, right now there are no ways for companies to launch satellites without having to send all of the equipment, to spend the money for shipping a lot of this equipment over to the United States or China or South America. How can we solve that problem? And so they formed the company Rocket Lab, and they are now launching satellites, launching things into space more quickly and more cheaply than anyone has in the region ever before. There was a problem, some engineers set out to try and solve it. Okay, and this is another influence of mine. This is an inventor named Dean Kamen. There's no audio, so I'll just sort of talk on top of it. Dean Kamen is an inventor. He's an engineer as well. And the big problem he set out to solve was the fact that if we could wipe out, if we could make it so that people have clean water, we could wipe out 50% of human disease on the planet. So what he worked with his engineers to do is try to make it so that we could create this device, it's called the Slingshot, that uses what's called vapor compression technology to purify water. You can actually take this device and pipe in water from disgusting sources like the river back of school, puddles, just a random bit of moisture that you might see somewhere. And basically, he took this sort of water, fed it into the machine, and he asked former US President Bill Clinton to drink it. And as he says right there in the video, he did, and he's still here. This machine works. So we went from this idea, this big question, how do we get clean water to people who need it, to a device that actually does it, and he's actually partnering with the Coca-Cola Corporation. Coca-Cola has one of the best distribution systems in the world. You can go to some of the most poverty-stricken places on the planet and still find bottles of unopened Coca-Cola there. And so one of his company solutions was to say, you have some of the best distribution systems in the planet, let's see if we can team up and use your distribution system with my Water Distiller to wipe out half of human disease on the planet. Pretty amazing stuff. That is the work of engineering. How many of you have your own personal plane? Yeah, awesome. Anyone else? Okay, cool. If you were given the task to make this plane better at what it does, how many of you feel you would do a good job with that? Okay, awesome. We've got one brave soul. Like, for example, let's say that we added an extra propeller to the front of the plane. How many of you think that would definitely lead to a better plane? Raise your hands. No? Not a few. You have 3 propellers, but this one has 4, right? Why don't you think that'll make a difference? Any ideas? Yeah?
Because you just maybe put a bit of unbalance to the plane.
It could be.
In front of another propeller.
Yeah.
It would like a lot of congestion.
Sure, it's great theory, right? How many know if Gio's right? Right? We don't have the knowledge to answer this question. I also will tell you, like, one solution is we could build 100 of these planes and then just make a whole bunch of little tweaks to each one, fly every single one and see which one flies best. How many of you would ride in that plane? How many of you think a company is actually going to spend the money to do what I just described? Maybe one, I don't know, right? It's not likely. This is expensive. How do we answer these questions, though, without building this plane and flying it? That is where the knowledge comes in. That's where knowledge and experience. Engineers have a whole bunch of tools in their toolkit to help them answer questions just like that. That's what engineering does. And so this leads me to a perfect segue to talking about Chris Rogers. Okay, Chris Rogers was one of my professors at Tufts University. He's the head of the mechanical engineering department. And he believes that everyone is essentially born an engineer. You can ask a kindergartner to solve a problem, and they will come up with a bunch of really, really interesting creative solutions to that problem. We see it with Project X here at SSIS. We saw, not with kindergartners, but we saw lots of really, really interesting ideas that came into fruition in a short amount of time, right? What's different about the younger students and professional engineers is just that toolkit. It's the knowledge that we can use some physics, we can use some technology to try to answer a question of how do we build a plane that flies better? How do we do that? How do we go about that process? We might have an idea, but knowing how to test it and how to get there is sort of where the engineers add a lot of their value. Right? But solving a problem is something that we do all the time. That is the idea of the engineering process. All right? We have to develop our skills in order to get there. This is my obligatory slide because Mr. Williams is in the room. Iron. How many of you know about the material properties of iron? You haven't covered that standard yet? No? Not yet?
Metallic bonds.
Right? Okay, cool. Well, really interesting thing happens when you take iron, which actually is it's a soft material. It's very flexible. If you take iron and throw in some just the right number of carbon atoms into it, you melt it down, mix the two together, it forms steel. Right? That's steel. Okay? You can change the carbon content a little bit, and you go from steel that is flexible and strong to steel that is rigid and able to withstand impact, for example. Right? Just little tweaks. The question about why it does that, that's a science question. Because the science that goes into this, that's materials science. Material scientists answer that question: why does the addition of these atoms change the properties? Why is it if we add some other trace elements into that steel, suddenly it doesn't rust anymore? That's the formation of something like stainless steel, right? Why does it do that? That's the science. The engineers think about the big problems that they want to solve. We want to build a frame for a car that's as strong as possible. What kind of steel should we use? How do we shape that steel? How do we manufacture it? These are engineering questions. The why, that's all about materials science. So we're starting to get into some of the differences here. The other thing I'll share, this is my older brother, Justin. Justin grew up very much as a scientist. My dad and I we are very much engineers. We like figuring things out. We like understanding how things work and making things. My brother, as a science guy, he liked to understand the why. He studied molecular biology and biochemistry at Yale and did a bunch of work for his PhD thesis in understanding how cells communicate with each other in a community. This is an image from some of his work on his thesis. Those blue blobs, those are the actual cells. And that green wispy stuff all around that's called an extracellular matrix. Cells, when they are together, they actually form this matrix, and they send chemical messages between each other so that they understand what's happening. And it's something really unique to cells that are living together in a tissue as opposed to just all by themselves. And so he was looking for a job, and he went to the University of Pittsburgh and basically said to their bioengineering department, I'm interested in some of the work that you are doing on tissue engineering. They were looking into growing artificial arteries. The idea behind growing the arteries is if you have heart bypass surgery, what they do is they take an artery out of your calf and they transplant it up here so that if there's a blockage in one of the arteries of your heart, the blood has another way to flow around out of the heart. Okay? But that involves two elements of surgery, one in your leg and one up here. So the idea is if we could instead grow just the right amount of tissue, right, just the right amount of artery, that maybe we could make it so that it's better for the patient, a simpler process. The lab was really interested in that, and they said, this is great. We're growing these tissues, it's going really well, except all our cells keep dying, and we don't know why. And my brother, as a scientist, with this background knowledge in the science of how cells grow and how to keep them alive, he said, oh, that's very interesting. I know why they keep dying. And the lab was really excited about that. They said, all right, great, will you tell us then? He said, sure, hire me. So he was recently named an associate research professor both in the School of Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh and also in the med school. So he is kind of bridging the two worlds of science and engineering in this really kind of cool way, and he loves it. He loves being able to do that. It's also kind of ironic that he is now working with engineers, given how much he and my dad and I would kind of spar growing up, disagreeing about what really matters. There's one more example I'll give, and that is GPS. How many of you use GPS on your phone for something? Okay, good. Who knows how it works? Got one?
I don't know for sure, but I think they have like a signal that sends to satellite and then back down and tracks something.
Okay, there's actually nothing going from your device to the satellite. It's actually just a one-way thing. The satellite, so you have it about half right. The satellites all have very accurate clocks on board. And all they are doing is essentially advertising the time that they think it is. And so what your phone is able to do is basically, it makes a guess for where it thinks you are in the world and says, if I'm right, if my guess is right, then that clock orbiting at that speed should say this time. That clock, which is a little bit farther away, takes some time for the signal to reach you, so that clock is going to be a little bit off. And basically it says, I think these satellites are there, and there. And it gets the signals from the satellites and sees how close it is. And it says, all right, I'm going to refine my guess. My first guess wasn't so good, but I think then maybe I'm here. And this process of guessing and checking, just guessing and checking over and over and over again is how GPS is able to figure out where you are on the entire planet down to an accuracy of about 5 meters. It's pretty amazing, right? Now, the knowledge that goes into this is that the physics folks, they answer questions of how do we make these clocks as accurate as possible, right? How do we make it so that the clocks, the satellites, are in a reliable orbit over time so that we know where they are? The mathematicians are the ones who sort of answer that question. How do we calculate how far that satellite is from where you are? How do you go from a guess and all of that data about what time it is from these satellites, how do you go from that to an actual location? The technology folks figure out how do you take all of these processes that have to happen from the physics and mathematicians, how do you take those and pack them into something that will fit in a phone or a watch? Finally, the engineers bring all of this together. And the engineers are trying to answer that question, answer the really important question that all of us want to know, and that is, where is my cab? Yeah? Where is the cab that I ordered? I am here, and I want a cab to also be here. How do I solve that problem? And so engineers have worked really hard on that. I'm going to do a quick little explanation then of how I think science, technology, engineers, and math are different. The scientists ask these questions. Do we understand how this works? Why is the universe the way it is? Can we make a theory and then test those predictions to see if that theory is right? Right? If those questions are the ones that interest you, you might be a scientist. On the other hand, if you're interested in that process, like how in the world do you go from a bunch of signals to a location on the globe? How do you calculate distances? How do you describe the world simple enough so that a computer can figure out where you are in the earth? Or how can you create an algorithm that makes it possible to tell the difference between the side of the road and a pedestrian if you're trying to do a self-driving car? How do you design those algorithms? That's the world of the mathematician. The art and technologists work really hard on the questions about how do we design something that fits the needs of people? How do we make something that will actually, when it gets in the hands of people, do what it is designed to do? How do you make something easy to use? Your great idea will mean nothing if you can't get it into the hands of the people that need to use it. That's the role of this, of our art and technology folks. And the engineers, they're the great connectors. Okay? They need lots of tools in their tool belt to be able to connect the knowledge of the scientists, the technology, the people who know how to build great technology, how to make things work for people, to ultimately solve problems that matter. That's the world of the engineer. And so I'll wrap up by just introducing, a lot of you know my daughter Nora, you've met her or seen her around, okay? She goes about the world all day kind of asking that question that I sort of started out with in my title slide, like how do we play with this? She goes around asking questions. She figures out how things work. This is natural. This is built in, right? It's part of our DNA as humans, really. what I want you to think about as you consider your options moving forward, wherever you are in the STEM or STEAM spectrum, I want you to think about what work matters to you. How do you find questions that really are interesting to you, that compel you to work hard on them? Because ultimately, if you can find that work, if one of the STEM highlights that I put here, if one of those kind of jives with you, I want you to consider looking more into that pathway, because it can be really, really meaningful when you are spending your day solving big questions. Everything that you learn in school, it's another tool in your tool belt. Okay? You may not really see how balancing equations or evolution or even the law of cosines, you may not see how these actually affect what it is you are doing on any given day. But these are tools that you might find later on you can use to answer some really big questions. And that ultimately is what STEM and STEAM and this way of living is all about. Any questions? Any questions from any of you? Yes?
Is your brother doing any more projects that are gonna in the future or something?
Yeah, so my understanding is that there have been a lot of there's been a lot of progress on some of the vascular, the work that he does, the growing of the artificial arteries. They're looking at the connection of trying to reduce abdominal aneurysms, blood clots within the stomach, and trying to come up with some ways to potentially engineer some solutions to that, which is really, really amazing. He loves the work that he's doing. He does a lot of teaching, but he also does a lot of research into very practical applications of his knowledge.
Can I have one comment? He has mentioned language arts and social science. Those are all subjects that connect the STEAM. Language to be able to communicate, right? Because if you can't communicate, how would you tell the physicists or the other fields what you need to do? Social science is allow you to reflect on the past so you can do better. So all the subjects are important, not just STEM.
If you are an engineer who can't communicate, you are not you're not going to be one of the engineers that gets snatched up by one of the big companies. You are not going to be able to really tackle some of the biggest problems if you can't communicate your ideas effectively to the people who might sell your idea or put your idea in the hands of the people who need it. And solving real problems involves actually understanding what those problems are. And we don't exist in a vacuum. We need to understand the context of ideas, and we need to understand people in order to really figure out what the problems are and how we might solve them. Okay. Thanks, everybody.